Welcome to the second lesson from Green Skills for Cities by the Vienna University of Economics and Business in Vienna, Austria. In today's lesson, we will be focusing on financing nature-based solutions and give you a short introduction into pitching. The content of today's lesson will be that we firstly look into financing mechanisms for nature-based solutions. We will also have a look at EU policies which are relevant for nature-based solutions. And also, as already mentioned, we will give an introduction into pitching. And lastly, you will get some information on the preparation for the in-class activities. The next two slides provide a glossary with the most important terms used in this presentation. You can have a look at these in more detail at your own time. This section will focus on financing nature-based solutions by looking into different financing and policy instruments. But what do we mean by financing nature-based solutions? Nature-based solutions are widely considered to be cost-effective and a cost-effective way to address climate change and biodiversity challenges, which result in economic, social, and environmental benefits. So the financing actually refers to sourcing funds to create and maintain a nature-based solutions project. But why do we need to finance nature-based solutions? Have a look at this video by the United Nations Environmental Programme, which stresses that investments in nature-based solutions need to triple by 2030. Now, this figure gives an overview of the classification of nature-based solutions finance worldwide. So you can see that the world is currently investing around $133 billion annually in nature-based solutions. The largest investments can be seen in dark green, which account for about $113 billion and is carried out by domestic government bodies, which mainly have the goal to protect biodiversity and landscapes, but also mixed with activities like sustainable forestry. The private sector, which you can see in pink, contributes around an additional $18 billion per year, mostly through investments in sustainable supply chains and environmental offsets. The small bottom part in turquoise accounts for around $2 billion annually, which includes public overseas development assistance, but also other types of investments which account for climate change finance, for example. Now, as already mentioned, a large part of the financing going into nature-based solutions comes from public financing. This can be, for example, EU funding. Examples would be the European Structural and Investment Funds, programs like Horizon 2020, or the Program for the Environment and Climate Action called LIFE. And there are several others which contribute to nature-based solutions. Then we have national governments, where funds and budgets are established by national or subnational governments, which have the aim to financially or also technically support adaptation action and, in that case, nature-based solution projects. But there's also innovative ways to use public budgets. An example being that you make use of untapped resources like the public health budget. But we will have a closer look at this later on. Then we have private financing options. The different categories are, for example, capital market, so using bonds, Examples here would be green bonds, the Natural Capital Financing Facility called short NCFF. Then there's also investments and commercial banks, meaning that some public financial institutions would offer low interest loans for projects which have the goal to deliver environmental and social benefits, which nature-based solutions often do. Then there's also foundations, one example being the Royal Parks Foundation in the UK. However, there's a lot of different foundations which offer funding for usually small-scale nature-based solutions. Then there's also innovative ways to fund, like, for example, crowdfunding. And other private sources would be interested residents, communities, but also private companies who are interested in nature-based solutions. Now, here are some more detailed examples of private investment sources. The private sector includes a wide range of investment categories. There's, for example, sustainable supply chains, which focus on sustainable forest, agriculture, fisheries, but also seafood products and projects. Then there's also biodiversity offsets. This is basically a measure to achieve no net loss or no net gain in biodiversity at project level. Then there's also private equity impact investments. These are investments in conservation or also biodiversity through thematic private equity funds, incubators, venture capital firms, but also ETFs, which is short for exchange traded funds. Then there's also several different conservation NGOs. These are then actively engaged in different activities which are related to nature-based solutions. Something I already mentioned shortly, philanthropy, so family and corporate foundations which are interested in nature-based solutions. Then there's voluntary carbon markets which have the goal of decarbonization through natural carbon solutions. Then there's different types of private finance through development finance institutions, development banks, other development agencies, but also climate funds like the Global Environmental Facility and something you might already know, the Green Climate Fund. Lastly, there is also another market-based solution called Payments for Ecosystem Services, which you can find in the glossary explained. Now there's also some other economic and financial instruments which have been developed to stimulate environmental conservation. These are very often embedded across EU environmental law, either in the shape and form of incentives, meaning subsidies and payments, or disincentives like taxes or charges. But there's also insurance-related instruments like risk transfer schemes and also tradable environmental permits, which are used to finance nature-based solutions. Now, overall, it is important to know where the finance to your nature-based solution project can originate from. Firstly, there is commercial funding, which is basically debt and equity finance, and it's typically provided by banks or investment funds, which can be public or private, as you can see in the left-hand box. Then there are programs with grant funding, which are basically concessional funding options. These are often available for projects at an early stage or with very high potential for environmental impact. An example would be public grants or funding from NGOs and so on. So these can also be public or private. But lastly, there is a way to combine concessional and commercial funding called blended funding. and there's several options for this. So these blended funding mechanisms can improve the access to financing because they might be below market rate. They can also de-risk projects for investors, and there is corporate support for project preparation and also technical assistance. An example of such a blended funding mechanism would be the NCFF, which is the Natural Capital Financing Facility. This combines an EU guarantee, but also a support facility with commercial lending and investing activities, which increases the access to finance for conservation, but also for nature-based solution projects in Europe. Now, there's different phases to financing nature-based solutions. 3 of these major phases have been identified, starting with the first one being the planning and design of the nature-based solution, which can take a long time, and it includes many different organizations and partners and can thereby be quite expensive. So these costs are very often covered by the public sector. The highest costs are usually the capital costs, which is basically the initial implementation of the nature-based solution project. These, however, happen over a very short period of time. And lastly, and quite importantly, are the ongoing operational costs, which entails the maintenance and operating costs of the nature-based solution project, but also called the stewardship phase. These can also be quite high and occur over a long period of time, and these costs should be considered in the planning phase of the nature-based solution projects. Now, these 3 phases don't just occur one time, they can reoccur multiple times over the entire lifetime of a nature-based solution, so they should be considered in the planning phase in detail. We have now seen a lot of different options how nature-based solutions can be financed, and it's quite complex. So as you can imagine, there's also a lot of challenges to finance nature-based solutions. Now, firstly, there's often unclear return of investment. The benefits are shared by many different users, like, for example, a public park and a flood management system. So the individual use of a nature-based solution is quite difficult to identify. There's also difficulties to quantify the benefits, as financing decisions are mostly based on a cost-benefit analysis. The problem with nature-based solutions is that the monetary but also non-monetary benefits are quite difficult to quantify. How do you put a monetary value on well-being, for example? But also the scale of nature-based solutions might pose problems. Some individual nature-based solution projects can be considered too small for direct financing by large financial institutions. But for example, large-scale projects are often also quite difficult to be financed, and also the knowledge to make a business case is missing. And lastly, also the collaboration for hybrid or blended financing can pose problems. The reason for this is that the dependency on the public sector financing, or for example, grant financing, can make projects quite vulnerable. And this is why it's so important to find multiple funding partners for nature-based solutions. And this is a very, very challenging task. Having looked at the different financing options, we will now have a short look on different EU policies and how these are important for the implementation of nature-based solutions. Now, generally, the policy landscape at EU level is quite complex, and there are different EU policies which support the uptake but also the implementation of nature based solutions, especially related to climate change adaptation. But this support is seen to varying degrees, and it's also seen that nature based solutions, but also related terms, so not just the term nature based solutions, are increasingly integrated in EU policy documents. Here you can see the different EU policies which have included and support nature based solutions either in a strong, explicit, or implicit way in dark orange, or they show strong support in light orange, or medium support in blue. Now, what do I mean by strong, explicit support? An explicit mention of nature based solution, especially in connection with climate change adaptation or disaster risk reduction, means that there is a strong embedment throughout the entire policy, which includes the objectives, the actions, and the instruments which can be implemented. Now, strong implicit support would mean that there is a very strong framing of nature, biodiversity, and ecosystems as a tool, basically, or as means to address climate change adaptation or disaster risk reduction challenges. However, there is no explicit mention of nature-based solution. So it's still strongly embedded throughout the policy, especially in the objectives, actions, and instruments, but nature-based solutions are not explicitly mentioned. Medium support basically means that nature-based solutions are mentioned explicitly or implicitly. However, they're not a prominent feature in the policy, and linkages to climate change adaptation are rather weak. However, still there's mechanisms included which indirectly support nature-based solutions. Now, lastly, the green box includes the newly still only proposed EU nature restoration law, which will include legally binding targets for nature restoration in many different ecosystems and will apply to every member state. So this can be an absolute game changer for nature-based solutions. However, it is still only proposed. As seen in the last slide, the policy landscape at EU level is quite complex. There's a large number of policies which show strong potential support for nature-based solutions. However, the degree and the type of support varies greatly and widely in practice. This is mainly due to the uptake of nature-based solutions being dependent on the member states' self-initiative and also their commitment to it. Generally, there is a lack of mandatory standards or also measures across EU policies, and there's a lack of coherence among policies and also quite fragmented governance arrangements. So basically, adequate funding is really needed to also increase the knowledge and evidence base for nature-based solutions, and this can foster a wider support and awareness for these measures. Now we will give you a short introduction into pitching. But why is pitching important? It is a very powerful tool to put ideas into the world and can be applied to, for example, your nature-based solution projects. To start the journey into pitching, please watch the first 8 minutes of this TED Talk by Simon Sinek on Start with Why. If you're going to pitch your idea on a nature-based solution, it's very important to know your audience. Who are you pitching to? Now, in our case, or in your case, this could be a private investor who is interested in your product, It could also be an audience with very little or no knowledge on nature-based solution. So you need to explain a lot of complex terminology. It can also be a city representative who has different ideas on nature-based solutions, or it can be an expert on nature-based solutions who knows quite well what you're talking about. So it's not only important to know who you're pitching to, but also how you speak to them. Now, generally, keep it short and simple. Less is more. You should be aware of the low attention span of your audience. Now make it exciting and relatable. No text overload, like the last few slides you've just read. No boring blah blah, no boring voice. Make it understandable and make it a personal connection as well. You should try to make it catchy and also unique so everyone listening to you will remember what you talked about. A simple tool you can use is basically storytelling. You have a story arc, you have a climax, you have rhetoric pause, you have drama, you have a red thread. So simply you would start off with, I experienced this problem. And then you relate it, saying that there are many like me, but we have a solution. And lastly, here's how the nature-based solution would work. Now, to summarize, the key takeaways for pitching is that you start with why. Then you should understand your audience, know who you're speaking to. Keep it short and keep it simple. And lastly, it's practice, practice, practice. The next slide provides preparation for the in-class activities, which you can have a look at in your own time.